Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe. Alan MacLeod joins us today, and we talk about his article titled Support the Tropes, How Media Language Encourages the Left to Support Wars, Coups, and Intervention, and how the media is used as an instrument to manufacture consent for regime change, various acts of war, and especially targeting left-leaning audiences. In a bonus segment, we talk about Alan's research into Bellingcat and his article titled How Bellingcat Launders National Security State Talking Points into the Press. Dr. Alan MacLeod is an academic, an author, and a journalist who does work on media analysis and politics with a focus on social media, Latin American politics, and propaganda. He writes for MintPress News and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. And he's written 2 recent books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting,
Alan.
And also Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent.
Yeah, it's been a while since
we recorded
last
this
talked.
on April 26th,
We
2021.
were in and around the same circles on Twitter and things like that. So it feels like you've talked to someone, but I think it's been at least a year since we last talked. And you're writing I have some articles here, both from FAIR and from MintPress. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is your Support the Tropes article. And, there are a number of them that I wanted to talk. It was hard to choose. You've got a lot of things going on. A very prolific writer, Alan is, and a great writer and a great researcher. I mean, the amount of research that went into this article is just stunning. But this one hits home for me, as you probably guessed. And I just wrote down some thoughts, like my perspective on this going into this is that, so in the 21st century, I'd say roughly 21st century, especially in very recent years, maybe you could say like since the Obama administration years, the anti-interventionist movement is sort of no longer exists on the left, which is a shocking thing in itself. The anti-war movement that once was on the left, or the Democratic Party and the left, were sort of known for that, having a strong stance in that arena. But that is no longer the case. And so the anti-war movement within the Democratic Party, at worst, it's gone. At best, it's silent, largely silent. Of course, there are always exceptions. So you talk about a long propaganda effort, I guess you could say, or I don't know what word you would use for it, but a definite effort to make that happen. Now, I'm not making excuses for the left or for the Democrats. I'm not sympathetic to excuses, but I think it's really important. This is an important analysis that you did, because this is a project. And so while I don't excuse people for just dismissing or just going along with the never-ending wars, for the interventionists, the regime change stuff, it is important to know what has enabled it. Particularly, I would say, for younger people on the left, it must have had a big impact on them. I mean, but overall, like, it's easier to just say nothing. This is not a profitable or a fun thing to do. You're not going to get a lot of praise. You're not going to get the awards, that kind of thing. So you can see, and a lot of people work in businesses that have some direct or indirect involvement with the war machine, if you will. So, but I guess one of the things that bothers me a lot is that not only is it just easier to say nothing, but you also have to ignore how the wars, the regime change operations have done great damage to groups of people, to demographics of people that you claim to champion. You have to just pretend that the harm and the suffering happening abroad to those same groups of people isn't happening. So, you need some a pretty serious effort to, and probably not just the propaganda, like, there are other, think there are no incentives, you get criticism, think there are other reasons why people probably aren't just aren't taking up the causes that they once did. You also, there's no draft. The wars are, intended to be invisible. There are a lot of reasons why, right? None of these are excuses, as I said, but you did a really important thing here, I think. And I like the catchy title too. It's provocative. First of all, let's start off with, I mean, the word trope is used very, very often, but what is a trope? Let's just go way back to some basics here. I had an idea in my head of what it was, but I thought, what is it exactly?
Well, I suppose you could say a trope is like a stereotype or a common saying that is used as a stand-in, sometimes in media, perhaps, an image for something like that, which evokes certain ideas. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like a stereotype, I suppose.
Yeah, sometimes I guess you could say it's a theme, if you take it a little further. And then, so when I looked this up, there were a lot of questions. What's the difference between a trope and a cliche? And I guess yeah, I did write it down. Common tropes used by establishment. Oh no, wait, that's from yours. I didn't write it down. So basically, if it's overused and really awful, it gets to be a cliche. I guess that's what they say.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's loads of tropes in advertising, for instance, or in movies or films and TV or whatever, where it's, the stand-in, somebody who's blonde will be always written as perhaps being a bit ditzy or not particularly intelligent, or, characters from a certain race might be portrayed as the same or not very hardworking, or these sorts of tropes, insert themselves into narratives. And they're not always purely negative like that. There are also all sorts of other ones around there. But certainly ones around war have become pretty important in the last 20 years. And that's what I was looking at in this piece.
Yeah. And the first one you bring up, and I'm glad you put it at the top because it's one of the things that really bothers me the most, is to think of the women. We have to save the women. Meanwhile, as far as I know, and anything I've ever read, the people who suffer the most from wars, from the other types of sanctions and regime change tactics that happen, the ones who suffer the most are the women and the children. I mean, it's hard, it's hard to pick out and say who suffers the most because so many people do. But this is one of those things where the hypocrisy just really gets to me, But yeah, let's talk about what you found when you dug into the think of the women trope.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I suppose there's always some level of buy-in that's necessary for a war among the public anyway. That's what the elite really need. They need at least America's more liberal have to, if not go along with it, at least be silent or not be actively opposing it. And, during the Vietnam War, for instance, 50 years ago, there was very, very widespread opposition to it, very active opposition as well, particularly from liberals, from students, from hippies, from the Black Liberation Movement, thinking about people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, who were very vocally anti-war, anti-imperialist as well. And people in Washington, war planners, called that the Vietnam syndrome. So in their eyes, it was like a serious disease or disorder that they had to cure the American public of. And I think in the last 20 years or so, they found a very willing partner in our corporate media. And how corporate media have managed to sell wars to liberals is by hijacking the language of progressiveness and of inclusion and diversity and using it against liberals' own instincts, which are usually actually very positive. Generally, we can say that conservatives tend to be a little bit more pro-war than liberals in the US anyway. There's a sort of gun culture, there's a very militaristic society. But liberals, not so much. And yeah, so big media outlets have now been starting to use tropes that have been developing over the last few decades about how they can sell wars, distinctly illiberal activities, to liberal audiences. And one of them they found is by talking about the woman. So, for instance, in the Afghanistan war, we were blitzed by articles talking about how this was really a fight to liberate women in Afghanistan. Now, of course, in the 90s, women in Afghanistan were treated horribly. It was one of the worst places to be in the world under the Taliban. But, not very often talked about is how the US actually propped up Islamic radicals in Afghanistan to begin with. But yeah, so in 2001, for instance, we saw hundreds of articles about how the Afghan woman would be liberated if only we could find the courage to jump into that conflict and do so. So, for instance, in 1999, there were 29 US newspaper articles and 37 broadcast TV reports about women's rights in Afghanistan. But between 2000 and September the 11th, 2001, that was 15 and 33 respectively. But just in a few weeks between late September and January the 1st, 2002, that went up to 93 and 628 TV reports on that subject. And so there was this constant narrative that actually the US troops were engaging in a feminist war, a feminist campaign to liberate women. Now, that should have been pretty obvious that that wasn't the case at the time, but certainly 20 years of war later, we can see that that's completely not the case. Today, only about a third of Afghan teenage girls can read and write. Very few of them will ever get to go to university. I believe only about 20% of Afghan teachers are now female, which pre-Taliban, that number was 70%. So actually, when you start looking at how women's rights have progressed in Afghanistan, there's much more of a devolution rather than an evolution going on. So that's pretty unfortunate. But even today, we're now being sold the idea of continuing the war on the grounds that if the US leaves, women's rights are going to get even worse. Now, that may or may not be the case, but the fact of the matter is that the highest military generals really don't give two hoots about Afghan women. They're just selling us a pile of ideas to try to continue to gin up some kind of support for this ongoing forever war, which is now 20 years old.
Yeah, I felt like I hadn't heard much at all about the cause of the Afghan women for years until the withdrawing from Afghanistan started to look, well, when the peace talks began, when it started to look like it actually might happen. So even though we've had statistics come out that some 70% of American people, and all that includes American military veterans, and say that it was never even worth fighting that war. So even though they knew that statistic was out there, it still didn't seem like important enough to bring the Afghan women cause back to the fore until, we're actually going to leave. And then it pops up again. And, it just shocks me that people are not embarrassed to parrot that stuff. But I guess they'll say anything.
Well, actually, people have been talking about think of the woman for 200 years. I mean, when the British were invading India, they constantly talked about the the concept of thuggy, which was in Hindu tradition. Quite often, women would throw themselves on the funeral pyre when their husband died. It wasn't that common, but it was reasonably common. And this was apparently cause enough in the cafe bars of London to justify some sort of British invasion. We have to civilize these people. We have to save the women. They use this in all across the Middle East when imperialists were trying to justify more and more wars. So actually, while we're talking about a modern iteration of this, this concept goes back hundreds of years, because it is really that effective in getting a certain sector of society on board with distinctly illiberal imperialist campaigns all around the world.
Did that coincide with the suffragette movements? Was it around the same time, or was it before? It must have been before women could even vote here, for sure, since we know
that's
that
right.
until the 19
Yeah, in the UK, the suffragettes didn't win the complete vote until 1928. Women over 30 were given the vote in 1918. But yeah, this what I'm talking about specifically was in the 19th century, when the British were really formalizing their rule over the Indian subcontinent.
So again, the hypocrisy of, another thing.
The trope, I'll just say the trope is kind of like the damsel in distress. That's so common in Western societies. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years in our legends and our myths, etc. And so that's really what they're playing on. It's this sort of quite chauvinistic idea that women need to be saved, and that we need to be the ones doing it by going across the other side of the world and bashing people's heads in and stealing their stuff. Somehow that's going to improve their lives.
Yeah, just to mention here too, another thing that has developed, I'd say over the last 10 years especially, was bringing, because the face of war was always pretty conservative warrior men, white men for the most part. And I guess they decided somewhere, I guess there's concern about lack of support for wars. I know, but bringing women forward to be the face of war is the thing now, which is just, I could barely even talk about that. It gets me so upset. Not only the women warriors, who are going to now help the recruiting numbers, which, required a culture change in the military as well, but the Hillary Clintons, the Samantha Powers, the Michelle Flournoys, and it's just, they're generally the policy people, the Amory Slaughters. More and more women are becoming the face of war. And first of all, you can't advance in that world unless you are already a very hawkish person. An anti-interventionist woman could not survive, and that would never be promoted. So, and I don't think it has anything to do with saving the women, bringing women to be the face of war. I think it has more to do with desperately needing something to sell war, frankly.
Yeah, the Israeli Defense Forces did studies on this, and they found that having a female representative for their television as their face of their military was much better. It played much better with British audiences and with American audiences too. So when you see IDF spokespersons on the television, they tend to be women, because it seems that they're much easier to emphasize with. So that's a very common thing that happens nowadays. We also see things like, the fact that the majority of the largest military contractors in the United States are headed by women. This is being celebrated as some sort of, feminist victory, or the fact that we now have female jet pilots in the US flying sorties all over the Middle East, bombing who knows what other countries. This is also presented as some sort of like breakthrough for women, or the fact that we've got female drone pilots. This is, some measure of equality. And by some tiny metric, yes, it is. But the much bigger stated problem is all of those millions of women who live in other countries who are having their lives destroyed. And ultimately, what we've seen in the last 10, 20 years with this new crop of women who are able to get up to these levels is that women are just as capable as being sociopathic and being bloodthirsty as men. And so, unfortunately, this sort of grisly equality we've ended up with really hasn't advanced the the lot of women around the world even one iota.
Yeah. Yeah, I mistakenly thought having more women in decision-making positions around war would be a good thing, that we would have less war. But that was foolish. It was a foolish thought. As you said, women can be just as bloodthirsty. But the main thing is that you can't advance in that world. You can't advance in that business unless you already have a war mongering mindset until you've proven that. You're just, the filtering out means that my thoughts were mistaken. Whether women seem to be less inclined toward war or not, you're just never going to get the women who are less inclined toward war in those positions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, William Bloom, the ex-State Department turned dissident, said that there's something approaching a Peter principle in the halls of Washington and the Pentagon and other big organizations, where people will rise to the level of violence they're willing to carry out. So if you go into, you might get hired at the NSA or the FBI or something as a low-level worker. But if you start talking about, is this really moral? Are we breaking human rights violations? Your superiors are going to be thinking, well, you're not getting promoted. We'll pass you down. But if you find yourself being completely willing to bomb a village, you might get promoted. Whereas if you're willing to just lie to the public to get them into a war, which might cost hundreds of thousands of lives, you might get promoted all the way to, head of the CIA or brigadier general in the military. And so ultimately, we've designed this macabre system where people, the most savage and the most violent-minded people, actually rise to the very top. We've selected them for that, unfortunately.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other tropes. I guess as I get older, I've seen some of these repeat themselves in different interventions. And so they're very obvious to me. But I guess what worries me is that people just coming up, there's new people to do this, to test this on, or whatever, to use this kind of propaganda on all the time, right? And they haven't seen it again. And by the time, I don't know, I hate to say, new sucker born every minute, as the old trope, but that is sort of the case. But you would think that there would be a critical mass at some point where, if you've seen it happen once and then you've seen it happen twice, you ought to be a little skeptical. If you see it a third time, there should be some kind of point when you've got enough people who have seen it enough times to be skeptical and to reject it. So I don't know. And the pace at which we are doing these wars and various types of, there's a whole long preparation process before it is war, where you have to demonize a person for, the
Sure.
leader, before your regime change. I mean, that's the kind of thing, your next trope you talked about, he's killing his own people.
Yeah.
Trope. And I'm trying to think, I've seen that definitely with Saddam Hussein. I've seen it with Gaddafi,
Assad in Syria.
So I'm on my third round at least on that. And I kind of remember in the 90s, well, I wasn't able to really pay that much attention, but in the Balkan Wars, it was certainly
Sure,
going on too. But I wouldn't have known enough about that to be able to pick up on it. So I've certainly seen 3 rounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, so liberal interventionists talked about Iraq as being this place we had to go into because Saddam Hussein was gassing his own people, the Kurds, which was indeed true. But what they left out was that the US was actually supplying him with weapons all throughout the 80s and shielding him from international criticism. So throughout his worst crimes against his own people, he enjoyed pretty much full US support. There was another article I found in the New York Times where their foreign correspondent, John Burns, actually made the case for why we have to go into Iraq And the cornerstone of his argument was actually the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison, which was this notorious Iraqi prison. Now, we all know how that turned out. If anyone listening to this knows what happened in Abu Ghraib under US control. But before the war, people in the New York Times, liberals, were saying, listen, the conditions at Abu Ghraib are so bad that it essentially merits us getting involved in Iraq. And this goes on through to Syria, or, as you said, to Gaddafi killing his own people. But ultimately, when you have a look at Google Trends data, what it shows is that there's generally big spikes in interest about, Libya human rights, or Syrian human rights, or Iraqi human rights, a few weeks before the United States starts bombing the country or starts intervening. And so basically the maxim I came up with is that if well-paid columnists in the West start talking about human rights in your country, all of a sudden, there's a pretty good chance you're about to get bombed.
I think I copy-paste your quote from there. You said, if well-paid US columnists start becoming preoccupied with human rights in your country, it's a pretty good sign that you're about to get bombed.
Yeah.
Which I'm laughing, but this is not because it's funny. It's just...
Well, actually, I mean, I heard the anthropologist David Graeber talk about this when he was talking to people from the global south, and they said, when big organizations start talking about human rights, they start getting very worried, because the only time they ever hear those sorts of words coming from Westerners is when they're about to start intervening in your country. So it's almost like alarm bells going off in a lot of people's heads, because they know what might come, because they've seen it 2, 3, 4 times already.
Yeah. Now, there are some adversaries who are starting to gain some traction and calling out the hypocrisy of that now. I see the fiasco in Alaska, as one of my podcast names was, the summit in Alaska. China flung that right back at us. Not that I'm laughing, but it's a travesty. But at least there is some pushback now that makes me think that this kind of manipulation may not work for very much longer. So maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Well, it might be a sign that China is growing increasingly confident, and we might be slowly moving towards a more multipolar world, like how we had in the 70s and 80s with the Soviet Union. I think China is certainly rising, but a lot of people predicting the end of the American empire, I think they're predicting that with their hearts rather than their minds. I don't think the US empire is going anywhere soon anyway.
Yeah, they don't just always come tumbling down. Sometimes there are long, slow, painful declines. Yeah.
But the US has been declining since 1945, so it's a very long case. I mean, at the end of World War II, the US had literally half the world's wealth, even though it had only a few percentage points of the world's population. And that's slowly been coming down over time. But it certainly has increased as we've seen China growing rapidly economically anyway.
Right. So the next set of tropes that you singled out was the democracy tropes. Again, just considering the current situation, just hypocritical to the max. I'm not quite sure how long this is going to work. And then there's a whole faction of people questioning, and even on the left, whatever the left is, wondering whether democracy is even the best system, sort of trying to undermine democracy overall. But for right now, it's still a great reason to go to war. It's still a great trope, right?
Yeah, I mean, I stuck to Latin America for this one, but we really could be talking about anywhere. There's constant talk about promotion of human rights and democracy abroad. In fact, the term democracy promotion has become this cottage industry with hundreds and hundreds of people in think tanks and NGOs supposedly promoting democracy, but they always seem to be doing it in enemy countries of the US, not friendly countries. People are not promoting democracy in Norway or the United Kingdom. They're promoting
Saudi
it in
Arabia.
places, yeah, they're promoting it in places like Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua. And that's where we see these, again, well-paid columnists writing op-ed after op-ed, talking about how Venezuela's democratic record is drastically going down. They never seem to pick a point about when Venezuela was a democracy, because they might have to say, well, actually 4 or 5 years ago it was, even though we were telling you at the time that it was a terrible dictatorship. And so constantly the tone of this is something must be done. And that something is generally not, talk to the United Nations. That something tends to involve F-35s, in my experience anyway, So yeah, this trope has been absolutely harnessed against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, against Cuba, against Belarus and Russia. Obviously plenty of these countries are not democracies, frankly, but that doesn't mean that the United States has this monopoly on democracies, or that it's a paragon of liberty itself. And so there's always this presupposition that it's the United States' job to be the judge, jury, and executioner. And because it has the strongest military by far, it is in a position to actually implement these things. And so, of course, when a country goes from being a dictatorship to a quote-unquote democracy, suddenly we don't hear about the coups, the massacres, the oppression of women. All of these things just fall by the wayside. And so, dictatorships like, for instance, Cameroon, where Paul Biya has been the head of state since Gerald Ford was in office. How many people even know who Paul Biya is? I don't think many people do. And the reason is because he's behaving himself. And so we never see, ABC or CNN or the MSNBC crowd talking about how we have to save democracy in Cameroon. And that's because it's behaving himself. It's behaving itself in their eyes, whereas countries like Bolivia, which has a much more thriving democracy than the United States does, is suddenly on this naughty list. And, suddenly there's all sorts of, well, maybe we should intervene. We have to, we have to do something in a way to stop this horrible dictatorship that's now forming once again.
Yeah, and it's actually doing double duty now, but I guess that would be a different trope. It would be that when we are building up a boogeyman, they're a threat to our own democracy. But again, it's same rough theme, but being repurposed.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, Venezuela, for instance, I think in 2015, Obama declared a state of emergency across the United States because of the clear and imminent threat that Venezuela was posing the United States. And that has been redeclared every year since then by Trump and now by Biden. This idea that Venezuela is somehow threatening the US. This happened in the 80s in Nicaragua as well, where they said that, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas are only a few days march from Edinburgh, Texas, which, is just absolutely crazy. The idea that this tiny army would march across Mexico and invade the US. In fact, the US tried to get Mexico on board with this and back up the statement, but the president of Mexico at the time, who was very pro-US, said that he simply couldn't do it because millions of Mexicans would die laughing if he ever made that pronouncement.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah.
And so the last category, we kind of already touched on that, the human rights. You frame it as who gets to talk on human rights. I don't know if you think we covered that well enough, or you have maybe some more to say on that.
Yeah, well, all I'll say about that is journalists have a lot of power over how a story is going to pan out. People think we're completely objective and, there's none of our interests go into it. But in reality, we choose pretty much who speaks in our articles. And if you really know what you're talking about, you already know what sources are going to tell you what when you go to them. And so plenty of journalists who want to push a sort of centrist or standard interventionist narrative will go to think tanks that always put out policy research which recommends that we go to war, because quite often they're funded by Raytheon and Boeing and General Electric and all these big weapons companies, whereas smaller think tanks that push a pro-peace agenda, like, for instance, the Center for Economic and Policy Research or the Institute for Policy Studies, are very rarely contacted. And so what I found was there was something between 5 and 10 times as much coverage for big pro-war foundations like the Heritage or the Center for American Progress, which is the more liberal one, than there is for those two pro-peace ones. And so ultimately, we get a situation where pro-war voices are saturated on television and pro-peace ones are relegated to the margins.
I wonder, the Quincy Institute is still new, but I think that's one of the reasons why, for their formation was to have a think tank with a more real foreign policy realist perspective. Maybe, I don't know if there's a way to characterize what their overall take is on war, but I would, if so, I would think that would be it. But I guess over time, you're going to be able to see how often they are referenced, right? Do you think that they'll just be sort of ignored by journalists to looking for sources, or have you seen any trend toward them at all? Or
I mean, in a word, yes, I do think they'll probably be ignored like the other two. It's really expensive to set up think tanks which are big and, put out all sorts of research. Generally, the think tanks that people have heard of, if they've heard of any, like, the Heritage Foundation or the Brookings Institution, they have hundreds of employees and they're all staffed inside big offices in central DC, just a stone's throw from the White House. They need millions of dollars every year to fund these activities. And generally, most of them get it from big corporations, like from, Wall Street or Silicon Valley, or from defense contractors. Those are the people who give out the big bucks. If you're in the pocket of big peace, you're really looking at, small donations like $20, $50 from individuals, because ultimately there are very few corporations in the United States who are interested in a radical peace agenda. And there's not very many billionaires either. So it's a similar situation to funding of political parties or funding of media as well, where ones that challenge the status quo are simply not going to be rewarded financially by the people who are benefiting from it.
Yeah, that's pretty frustrating.
Which is why, by the way, all of you should go to patreon.com and support the Around the Empire podcast. Because, anti-empire stuff or things that are progressive, generally, we're operating on a shoestring in comparison to the big networks.
Yep, we are. Well, on that note, how about if we shift over to the bonus question about good old Bellingcat?
Oh, well, that's perfect, because that sounded like I was just finishing when I put in a plug for you.
It did, didn't it? So, and I think you have some newer work on this too. I don't know if you want to I saw there was a new article that I hadn't read yet.
Yeah, sure, I can combine them.
So I don't think this needs much of an introduction at all. So you've been digging into Bellingcat, and I'm dying to hear what you found.
The answer to the bonus question is in the extra bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to all bonus content by subscribing at Rockfin or Patreon, plus other perks like patron live streams, Zoom calls, and access to our Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my pitch, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up.
All right. Well, I've kept you a long time, so we should probably wrap up. Anything else you'd want to say on that before we do wrap up?
I think we covered it all, didn't we?
Yeah, I think so. Well, listen, it was great talking with you. Please let everyone know how to follow your work, where to find you, how to support you.
Sure, yeah. So I write at two places. I'm senior staff writer at MintPress News, mintpressnews.com, and I also write at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. That's fair.org. I'm not that big on social media, but you can follow me on Twitter at Alan R. MacLeod, ALANRMACLEOD.
Thanks so much. Great talking with you.
Nice to speak to you.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Alan MacLeod. Follow Alan on Twitter at Alan R. MacLeod, MacLeod. Find his work on MintPress News. Look for his books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and the other book, Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. This podcast, independent media. Listener support, really important. Rockfin.com/AroundTheEmpire, Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find it on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Rockfin, Patreon, YouTube, and more platforms still coming. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.